now, Pamela McCall on CFAX 1070.
Rebuilding Fort McMurray. That's what we're going to talk about next. My guest is Glenn McGillivray, Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western University. Good morning, Glenn.
Morning.
Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
An absolute mess up there. What challenges will Fort McMurray face in rebuilding?
Well, unfortunately, we've seen it before in places like Slave Lake, Alberta. It's a widespread loss, so it has a tendency to really tax resources. But one of the first things is to get infrastructure back up and running. We can't even think about rebuilding until critical systems are back, and that includes power, telephone cable, heat, light, all those sorts of things. Once we kind of address those sorts of things, we also have to look at things like remediating the soil. Believe it or not, so after a big fire like that, there tends to be a lot of toxins in the soil, and that at least that surface layer of soil needs to be taken care of, either scraped and removed or remediated in other ways. But when things burn like vinyl siding and such, it can really make a toxic mess in the ground. So once we kind of do those two things, we can start thinking about putting things back.
Doesn't soil remediation take quite a while?
Well, I guess it can, especially when we're talking about such a widespread area like has been affected here. It does take time, but it's nothing new. They've been doing it in the U.S. for some time now, and it's really a good move looking at the long-term health of people. Just to scrape off that top bit of soil and get the toxins out of there is a good thing to do. And it will ensure that we rebuild on a solid basis in a way.
Glenn, that speaks to taking some time. I had a fellow from Victoria who lives in Fort McMurray now, and he and his girlfriend and their two dogs managed to escape. And they were looking at a couple of weeks. He's waiting for a call from Suncor to go back to work. But how long, in terms of it being given the toxin element, how long are you suggesting that it might take before people can go back in?
It's really, really hard to say. First thing depends on the powers that be, when they decide to let people back in. And in my experience, what they've done quite often is let people in for a very short time, usually in a controlled way, either using police or other sources, and bringing people in on buses or in small convoys, and giving them a chance to see things. Then after that point, they can maybe decide who might be able to go back permanently and who can't, and that will depend very, very greatly on the property loss and if there's just damage, how extensive that damage is, and that sort of thing. You certainly don't want people in the way at this point. That's a sad way of characterizing things, but there's so much that has to be done now that getting people in the way would be a hindrance to them and to other factors. So it's so hard to say. One of the things I looked into over the last few days is I tried to figure out when the first house was started after the Slave Lake wildfire, the first house to be rebuilt, when that was started, and I couldn't find that out. But I did find out that the first house to be finished was Thanksgiving of 2011. So the fire was in May of that year, and the first rebuild was done 5 months later. So those are I'll give you some of the idea of some of the challenges that are going to be faced over the next while.
No kidding. Let's talk about power. How is the city powered, and what is involved in restoring that?
I couldn't speak to Fort McMurray personally. I don't know how old their systems are and whether they're buried. That's a big factor. Or whether they're above ground. I think there's a lot of older sections of Fort McMurray, so you may see some overhead infrastructure there. Wooden poles and overhead lines and things like that aren't very robust, so those things have to be restrung. But, the hydro crews are pretty used to that. Those systems aren't really built to withstand, major storms, major winds, major ice storms, wildfires. They're built to basically be, restrung pretty quickly. And so those sorts of things, they'll be challenging. It'll take a while, but we're pretty good at it. The other question, though, is things like substations, transformers, buried infrastructure, and that sort of thing. That's where you can kind of get into and more delays, particularly on supplies. Do we have extra transformers and step-down stations and things like that? Haven't heard a thing about the damage to the system yet, so I don't know if that will be forthcoming, but a lot depends on the damage and the ability to get replacement equipment in. And that was a pretty big challenge in 1998 after the Eastern Canadian ice storm. Getting poles, getting insulators, wires, all those sorts of things was a bit of a challenge, and we had to go far and wide to get supplies, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, because of the scale of it.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. What about commercial structures? Obviously, a toxic element there too. What other considerations are there with commercial structures?
When you get into commercial, it can be far more complex than houses, as you can probably appreciate. And one of the things is a business might be fine, it may be completely untouched, but it may not have electrical power, for example, or the workers might not be able to get to work. Suppliers might not be able to supply, and so on and so forth. So along with that physical damage possibility, you also have to consider damage to other things like suppliers, key suppliers to your business. And so things like business interruption insurance kind of plays into that, and other more complex insurance coverages. But there's certainly going to be, I think, a lot of those types of claims in this event.
Business interruption claims.
Business interruption claims, generally speaking, well, if you're offline, your business is offline for, say, 3 days or more, that's generally when business interruption may kick in, assuming that, the business has that coverage. And then there are various ways it can be covered, but one of the important things is that businesses have financial statements on hand to help the insurer determine where the business should have been and what the earnings are and that sort of thing, and then they can start looking at coverage and reimbursement.
What if the statements are burned?
Well, hopefully there's backup. Hopefully there's accounting firms that have this data. There's probably the possibility to go to Revenue Canada and get some back statements and things of that nature. It'll be worked out. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, it's just a big headache.
A big headache. This is not going to be easy for a lot of folks, but it really raises the whole spectrum of businesses having continuity plans. And what the research finds is that 1 in 4 small businesses that are affected by a catastrophe never come back again because they just weren't ready. And so it's really, really important that businesses, and particularly smaller mom and pop shops, put together a business continuity plan.
Such as, what does that need to contain?
Well, it varies according to the business, but we actually have a free kit on our website, ICLR.org, that allows small business to put together a plan. The whole kit is there. It's free. All you need is maybe 2 or 3 hours, depending on how complex your business is. But it allows you to figure out ways to communicate with your employees if they can't get into work. It allows you to communicate with your suppliers, to list them first of all, and determine what it is you get from these people and how you should contact them after an event. It lists things like critical equipment you may need and how to replace it, whether it's computer software or manufacturing equipment, whatever. But it's all there, and it allows small businesses to just invest a few hours, and they can have a nice, robust business continuity plan just ready to go.
That's a really great idea. We live in an earthquake zone, so and also we're being warned about urban interface wildfires here in Victoria, potentially. So, Glenn, give us the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. That's the ICLR. What is the website that our listeners can go to access that information?
So ICLR.org will do it for you. And on that website, you can find such things as the business continuity kit I just told you about. That's called Open for Business. There's also a range of other resources that would help you determine how to protect your home from different perils like wildfire, like basement flooding, like windstorm and winter storm, and a few other things. Get more information on things like sump pump systems, on backwater valves. There's a whole range of things there, and it's all for free.
Glenn, should we be getting, as homeowners, insurance against wildfires here in Victoria?
Well, good thing is that fire is covered under the standard policy. In fact, property insurance got its roots in fire. Property insurance was created because of the peril of fire. And so fire is virtually always covered in a policy, and so there's no need to get anything extra. Fire is not distinguished in any way, shape, or form. A fire is a fire, whether it's a wildfire or a house fire. The only time you wouldn't be covered, of course, is if you criminally set your home on fire. Any other time, a fire is covered, and so that's a good thing.
Got a question here from Ryan. Hi, Pamela and guests. Just wondering if they only lost 10% of the homes and if more than 10% of the people have left because of the oil downturn, it seems rebuilding is not as urgent as it might have been elsewhere.
Well, it doesn't quite work that way. It's not going to be the same 10%, right? So 10%, first of all, still adds up to a fair number of structures. We're trying to do some back-of-the-envelope calculating based on some of the public satellite shots, and it's pretty substantial. The real question is how many people will choose to rebuild and how many people will just take the check and walk away, and that's a big wild card. We don't know. He's right, though, that with the price of oil being depressed, with the economy not great in that area, with a lot of people living there from other parts of the country, we may see a bigger proportion of people deciding just to take the check and walk away. But it's really hard to say at this point.
Wow. Fascinating interview. Thanks a lot for being with us this morning. Just a note for our listeners, I'll be speaking to an expert from the UBC Sauder School of Business about restarting the oil sands after this interview. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
Glenn McGillivray, Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western University. Once again.